affecting quite a lot of people tonight. Here are some headlines recently that have appeared in mainstream media over the past few months. Parents wanted to opt their children out of Black History Month. A Utah school let them. Lawmakers in 5 states want to punish schools that teach the 1619 Project. White House releases 1776 report that tries to erase the legacy of slavery. Tonight, we have an historian and an educator with us who has been on the forefront of the battle to build inclusive curriculums that address marginalized groups in the telling of our national story, which in turn will help build more engaged citizens. This is increasingly urgent, since as a recent writer put it, we can't confuse the worship of founding principles with the effort to make sense of how the US developed and changed over time. Dr. Lillie Johnson Edwards is Professor Emerita of History and African American Studies at Drew University, where she served for 23 years, including her role as the founding director of Pan-African Studies and director of American Studies. She served as a gubernatorial appointee and charter member of the New Jersey Amistad Commission and co-chair of its curriculum committee from 2002 through 2020. She's also a lecturer at the Adult School of Montclair. Welcome, Dr. Edwards.
Thank you so very much, and it's wonderful to be here this evening. I see, there's some people from my mill and from my adult school classes, so I hope tonight I can say something new that you haven't heard before. I'm going to share screen. I assume I've been made host already or co-host in order to do that. And we will begin. So, tonight, what I would like to do is to address the following issues that support excellence in education for children and teens. We'll look at the meaning and significance of engaged citizenship. In some ways, we should see engaged citizenship as the result of excellent teaching. We'll look at engaged citizenship and the issue of inclusion, why those two are inextricably linked. We'll look specifically at the New Jersey Amistad initiative. And I know we may have some viewers here from other states. And so if you have questions for me about how New Jersey created this initiative, I'll be happy to answer those questions during the Q&A. And then finally, we'll look at some models of educational excellence, ways in which school districts have indeed implemented an inclusive curriculum for its students. We begin with the meaning and significance of engaged citizenship. A passport. Many of you have one. It seems like an obvious place to start talking about citizenship in general, because this single document defines and provides for my legal status as a citizen of the United States of America. TSA, immigration officials in foreign countries will look at it and that it's true. It is my proof that I am an American citizen. But it is a thing. It is an object. It is inanimate. It is a staple and bonded group of pieces of paper. But this evening, what I want to do is invite you to think about ways that our students and our nation might come to understand citizenship as more than a legal document and a noun, but rather will understand citizenship as a verb, as something that we do, citizenship as performed. We can begin with the preamble of the Constitution itself, which is more than a legal document, because the preamble says, and I want to focus on the verbs here. The preamble says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish
Shouldn't put your
justice,
Zoom link on Twitter.
ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And so what we should be asking our students to do and have them understand is that we perform citizenship. The preamble makes it very clear that we, the people, form, we establish, we ensure, we provide, we promote, we secure, and we do ordain and we do establish. What we want our students to know and understand from the study of history is how citizenship has been done and what are the responsibilities of
girl, I get what
and
you're
why
saying.
citizens should shift voluntarily from being partakers of citizenship. In other words, we can sit back and just enjoy the rights and privileges and have our passport. We want our students instead to be active participants who are forming, establishing, ensuring, providing, being the verb of citizenship.
Yeah, being the verb.
One of the places where we see citizenship perform is in the process of naturalization, because naturalization will require civic tests. And it also, I looked it up online, it also in the brochure has an actual list of responsibilities of citizenship. Some of these responsibilities that you see listed here are enforced by law. For example, we have to pay our taxes and we have to respond to the call for jury duty, but others are at our discretion. Staying informed of the issues affecting my community and participating in the democratic process is an individual decision. Respecting the rights, beliefs, and opinions of others falls somewhere in between law and personal choice. If it's sexual harassment or a bias crime, it is punishable by law. But many acts of disrespect are endemic to our national landscape, whether it's sexism or homophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, body shaming, xenophobia. All of these are so common that they appear in jokes and in tweets and in offhand comments with no repercussions whatsoever. When we look at this process of performing history and being inclusive in our history, the engaged citizen and all of us as citizens need to figure out how do we teach that. There are two major opposing views that Donna Ward mentioned in her introduction. One, articulated very well by Governor Tate Reeves of Mississippi, argues against, and I quote, introduction in the far left socialist teachings that emphasize America's shortcomings over the exceptional achievements of this country. He goes on to say, revisionist history has aimed to tear down American institutions, and it is poisoning a generation. Capitalism, democracy, and other uniquely American values have been victims of a targeted campaign from foreign and domestic influence aiming to destroy the pillars of our society. The United States is the greatest country in the history of the world. No other nation has done more for its citizens or to advance freedom and prosperity across the globe. We need to combat the dramatic shift in education, end quote. In other states, I believe Donna mentioned this, some lawmakers are seeking to punish schools that teach the award-winning 1619 project curriculum in particular. The opposing view supports arguments like those of Professor T. Jameson Brewer at the University of North Georgia, who said, "Do we want historical facts and details that are researched and published by experts taught, or do we want nationalism taught?" My friend, Professor James Grossman, historian and executive director of the American Historical Association, which has 12,000 members, said, "You cannot heal divisions by pretending they don't exist." As I thought through what the governor of Mississippi is suggesting we do in education, my first thought was, this is exactly what dictatorships do. If you look at the slide I've created for you, what you see on one side is what democracies teach. Democracies teach that it's good to acquire and analyze new information, that human beings and institutions are imperfect, and that the reason we need engaged citizens is because we need people to analyze and question new information and perspectives, because you're always working in a context of imperfection. Democracies kind of invite critique as the core of engaged citizenship, and democracies have a goal of serving the common good, the entire community, of being inclusive. Dictatorships hate new information and discoveries. Dictatorship assumes there is perfection and that only certain people have that perfection. Dictatorships hate criticism. Dictatorships hate questions. They view questions as being unpatriotic. And dictatorships assume that there are always winners and losers, not a common good. When we think about, again, that preamble to the Constitution, it says that we are going to create a more perfect union, not a perfect union. And in fact, what we know is true is that that first attempt to create the United States of America didn't really go well, because we created the Articles of Confederation that really didn't work at all. And they were so flawed that the entire thing was thrown out and a brand new Constitution was written from scratch. And even when we look at that Constitution, we know that it affirms America as a slave state and includes the slave trade and the enslavement of Black people in that Constitution. So we know that unlike, I believe, one Congresswoman who said that the Constitution really had never been changed, in fact, the very first effort, the whole thing is thrown out. So what do we do about those kinds of questions the governor of Mississippi said we shouldn't include? The question I would like to ask is, the Constitution actually creates a race state by including in national law Black people's enslavement. Do we exclude the whole Constitution from US history? Do we skip 250 years of African enslavement? Do we say that those millions of enslaved people don't exist? Do we skip the 250 years of enslavement and skip the 5,000 Black patriots who fought in the Revolutionary War? Do we skip the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War and the congressional debates about the expansion of slavery? Do we skip the economic history of Black people's cotton production that provided 80% of all the cotton in the world in the 19th century? Were 4 million Black people on the eve of the Civil War a figment of our historical imagination? Do we erase the history of public education in the South, including Mississippi? Public education created by Black men during that really short period of time in Reconstruction when Black men were allowed to hold public office in Reconstruction governments. Do we say to Japanese Americans that their property wasn't really confiscated? Their families weren't sent to internment camps while their sons and fathers fought as American citizens? Will we skip World War I and the returning Black soldiers who were targeted specifically because they had on a US Army uniform? Is the governor's plan to ignore Charles Hamilton Houston at Howard University, who created civil rights law, the same civil rights law that today protects women and protects the differently abled? From the period of the Revolution to the present, every era of American history has revealed the challenges of creating a more perfect union, not a perfect union, but one that's in a permanent state of evolving to be better, to establish more justice, to ensure greater domestic tranquility, to create a stronger common defense, to give greater coverage for the general welfare, for example, during a pandemic, and to guarantee liberty for the present and for the future. So my point is this: there is no American history, none, not the Constitution, not wars, not economic upswings and downturns, not scientific discoveries and inventions. There is no American history without African Americans. I would ask the governor, how is inclusion racist or divisive? Unless policymakers are asserting that in the 21st century, Black people aren't citizens, aren't part of America at all, have contributed nothing, and essentially don't belong in America. Black people have confronted this paradigm of exclusion from the American narrative for centuries. It's not new. Ulrich B. Phillips, pictured here, was the most revered, most studied Southern historian in the entire first half of the 20th century. It's not that long ago. I have colleagues, white colleagues, from the places where I've taught who told me that in graduate school, they read Professor Phillips' works on the South. And what Phillips does in one of his works, for example, American Negro Slavery, the first systematic analysis of slavery in the South, he says that the slave system was one of proprietary proportion and cooperation. He says that the plantation was a chapel of ease. He writes that the labor system, quote, shaped by mutual requirements, concessions, and understandings, produced reciprocal codes of conventional morality. So this is a man describing enslavement of Black people as a moral system. And so we know what eventually happens is historians revise that story about what enslavement means. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, in the first decades of the 20th century, at the same time, Ulrich B. Phillips is writing that slavery actually was a benign system and appropriate for Black and white race relations. Carter G. Woodson receives his doctorate in history from Harvard University and he launches the work that the Amistad Commission of New Jersey and the state are doing today. Woodson understood that if a race has no history, as the governor of Mississippi assumes, I guess, will be the template for his state, Woodson writes, if a race has no history, if it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. And I would suggest that making Black people in American history a negligible factor diminishes our democracy, not only because of the exclusion, but also because the American story itself would be abbreviated, a mere shadow of itself, incomplete and therefore false. In response to the exclusion of Black people from American history and caricatures of Ulrich B. Phillips's happy slaves and brutish free Black men and women in those caricatures, Dr. Woodson created an ambitious program of scholarship, research, publishing, and curriculum development. He created the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, along with branches nationwide, local branches nationwide. He began the academic publication of the Journal of Negro History and also the Negro History Bulletin used for general audiences. He launched Negro History Week, the week between the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, as at the time for scholars and teachers and community activists to gather at the organization's headquarters in Washington, D.C. And before any historical organization ever thought about K-12 education, Carter G. Woodson began to work on African Americans being included in K-12 curricular materials. His work continues to this day, and you see on the slide the very first issue of the Journal of Negro History, published in 1916, and the most recent issue, published winter of 2020. We now begin to look directly at the New Jersey Amistad Bill and the inclusive curriculum. As I said earlier, the work in New Jersey follows the tradition established by Dr. Woodson in that this legislation asks for the inclusion of all Americans and asserts that that inclusion democratizes education and creates engaged citizens who continually ask, has the nation formed a more perfect union? Have we established justice? Have we ensured domestic tranquility? Have we provided for the common defense? Have we promoted the general welfare and secured the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity? For only in posing these questions can we ask students to be active citizens. We have to ask our students, what does it mean to establish justice? What does that look like? We have to teach our students the success stories as well as the challenges of human beings making those decisions. We have to tell our students what injustices Americans have created and the injustices we fought against. In the New Jersey Amistad legislation and others like it, such as the Holocaust, the LGBTQ, Latinx legislation, all of these seek to have K-12 students understand a history of human actions that sought a more perfect union. What I have for you on this slide is the 2018 to 2021 process through which Commissioner Biebler-Johnson and I wrote this legislation, worked with the commission on lots of revisions, completed those edits, and then worked with both members of the Senate and House for legislation to be introduced, passed, and then approved and signed by Governor Murphy. What does the legislation do? It asks every Board of Education to include in the curriculum of all K-12 schools instruction that infuses into all courses on the United States African Americans in industry, military, government, professions, local communities, in math, science, medicine, space, architecture, arts, social institutions, and culture into the fabric of American life. What is enumerated within that legislation are these items that students need to know. And what I want you to pay very close attention to is the fact that performed or engaged citizenship is inherent in the legislation itself. It says that students must know and understand the nation's heritage of slavery and freedom, the impact of African diasporic cultures and institutions on the Americas, contributions of African Americans. But here's a piece that asks students to use critical thinking to link the past and the present. They need to know and understand that inequality is a consequence of prejudice and discrimination in the pursuit of maintaining power and dominance over certain portions of society. And what you should see embedded here is inequality is inconsistent with the general welfare and common good of the population that we are asked to perform by the preamble to the Constitution. Students are asked to know and understand citizenship and disenfranchisement. And in the next one, it says students need to know and understand that issues of moral dilemma and conscience have a profound impact on the nation and the self-image and self-realization of what? The entire population. Again, we're coming back to that common good general welfare issue so clearly stated in the preamble. And then it says that instruction will emphasize the personal responsibility of students. We end here by looking at some models of and some ideas on how to do this, right? And so it's all good for a commission to say to school districts and teachers and administrators, kind of, we want this to be done. But I think we also need to provide the support for that work. So what I created, I'm sorry, this doesn't come from the commission. I created this very short list that shows the minimum that districts need to do. A school board resolution needs to be adopted that explicitly states that a district will execute these changes in curriculum. Area supervisors or principals need to review teacher lesson plans to figure out whether or not or how a teacher may need help and support. There needs to be ongoing professional development and training, a revision of the actual curriculum to make sure there are no gaps where you look through a period of history and you see no Black people in America. That needs to be fixed. And then, of course, every school wants to fulfill their New Jersey QSAT criteria. I know there are COVID policies where they was delayed. And because of that delay, this would be the perfect time for school districts to ensure they can check all the boxes of the work that needs to be done for inclusion. 3 of the districts who have done this work, Hoboken, Roselle, Elizabeth, there are many more, but I wanted you to be aware of those who have done this work. And then finally, here are the steps that I suggest we could all take in the state of New Jersey to make sure this happens in as many as possible of the 600 plus school districts. I know there may be some of you on from other states and you're thinking, you have 600 plus school districts in New Jersey? Yes, we do. that's a challenge, but here's some steps we can take, and then we'll move to Q&A. There are teachers both in these model districts, and there are more than those three, there are others. There are teachers in model districts. There are teachers and administrators who have attended Amistad Summer Institutes, who we should now regard as master teachers, who can actually be the consultants and the workshop facilitators for other districts, right? We have this resource who's already trained, who's already done the work, who can really be the experts for their colleagues. We need to turn to the League of Women Voters, to museums, to historical societies, libraries that already work with school districts, and partner with them to come up with a strategy to get the statewide implementation, because these are organizations that are already infused with it throughout the state's work on K-12 schools and teachers. We can use this statewide platform to probably apply for some major foundation grants. We need to take all of these model districts, and as they implement an inclusive curriculum, we need to celebrate them, promote them, and recognize that work. And then finally, the Amistad website itself can be a portal for districts to access very easily model district plans. In other words, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can see everybody's plan, which will not be identical, right? Because we assume that districts are adjusting what they're doing for their particular constituent of students. But it would be useful, right, for a district to be able to see what immediately on that website, to click and see the curriculum that other districts have developed. And then finally, of course, the bottom line, the first line are our teachers and the work that they're doing day to day. We can't thank them enough. There are hundreds of lesson plans, I'm sure, by grade level and cued to the relevant standards that teachers that the Amistad Commission could post on its website, and teachers then have an immediate resource to fill in the gaps for their curriculum. The lesson plans could be indexed as well. I didn't put that as another category, right? So if a teacher is saying, I have no idea what to do with my fourth graders, and I want to talk to them about the nation expanding, right, in the 19th century. I have no idea where Black people are in this story. Wouldn't it be wonderful if a teacher could go to that index and find fourth grade national expansion, Black people, and click and have 12 different options for a lesson plan? And so, in the end, students are learning about America's very complicated and very often contradictory past. But isn't that what we want them to be prepared for in the present and future? We want our students to be prepared for a life that is constantly presenting contradictions. We want our students prepared for a life that is constantly presenting them inconsistencies. We want our students prepared to make decisions in a complex world. And what better laboratory can we provide for them than the nation itself, which we love and which we owe an allegiance and which we owe a critique and we owe a future for posterity. Thank you so very much. And I will stop the screen share and we will head to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. That was terrific and so interesting. I guess my first question, and we'll get to questions from the audience, but I guess my first question is, you know, I have 3 children who are now in their 30s, so I haven't been dealing with having kids in school for a very long time. But I thought this was already done. You know, how is it that it's 2021, we're still talking about the Amistad curriculum? I thought this was implemented like 20 years ago.
It has been a very long time, which is why I developed those last few slides that you saw, which is a kind of a really short list. It's not 20 pages. It's a short list of what districts need to do, number one. And I do think there has been a lack of clarity in communication as to exactly what districts needed to do. And so the messaging to districts, and so this is kind of taking some of the weight off of the districts. The message to districts has been, you need to implement this, or you need to implement legislation. It needed to be translated into, you need to develop a curriculum and a plan to ensure that teachers are trained and comfortable with that curriculum and that it is appropriate for your particular constituency of students. I believe this to be true. I heard from someone that a district thought they were to teach the Amistad Mutiny. Now, it's fine to teach that mutiny because it involves kind of diplomacy. There's a Supreme Court case. I did an entire lesson several years ago, okay, over a decade ago, for Summit, where the entire 7th grade, everybody participated in a full day project with prior preparation, and we did the court case, and people played President Buchanan, and so yeah, it was Black people in American history, right? But I was told some districts were worried how they would teach the Amistad Mutiny to elementary school students. And I thought, there's a communication problem here. So I think that's part of it. I also think there's what you saw in that very last slide is something I created only recently, which was in my mind of how do you get to 600 districts. You use all of the resources that are out there have been doing that work all along. I do think, and I know this for a fact, there are districts who've always done an inclusive curriculum. There definitely are teachers who've always done it. I think that one of the things the commission hasn't done is to, in fact, create some sort of platform to find out who is already doing the work. And so it looks like it isn't being, I have worked with school districts where they have brought me in, right, to do a lecture on Black Lives Matter, and they're talking about what students are reading and the curriculum they're doing. And I have asked them, you know, without being too intrusive, saying, well, you know, have you gone through your curriculum to see what revisions need to be done in terms of Amistad? And they would look almost puzzled, like, why would we do that? And yet what I heard them telling me was that they were doing that.
I see. Okay.
So I think some of it is reporting, recording, and communications.
Okay, good. I see that there's questions now coming in the chat, and I want to have our audience be allowed to ask some questions as well. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ann Moore. Ann, do we have some questions for Dr.
We do. We have a few questions from one participant and the first question on the list was, is there any accountability for districts to implement your program?
There is. It's one of the reasons at the end in that list you saw me give for school boards and school districts what they want to make sure they are doing. That very last one is that they fulfill the NJQSAC criteria. as all of you may know, there is brand new legislation that the governor just signed in January. And what that should mean is that on the NJQSAC, as is the case with all of the other requirements for New Jersey, is that the requirements of the Amistad legislation, that kind of bulleted list I gave you, would be required of every school district. And the way NJQSAC works, as I was told by people at DOE last year, is that schools are required to meet every criteria within a category, or they get no credit at all. So it's a pass-fail system with, you know, A or F. And so that school districts are very invested in making sure they can check every box. What needs to happen, however, is that, of course, schools get all the support they need. Again, it's not that complicated. I spoke in Elizabeth a year and a half ago, I think, and their school district heard I don't know, I think I had 15 minutes and essentially presented, these are 5 things you need to do. And they called me the next week and said, we can do those 5 things. You know, can somebody, you know, can you help us do these? And I said, I'm afraid of 4th graders. You need a teacher. You need a school teacher to help you work on this. You need, so I recommended to them a master teacher from Montclair and said, you know, hire her. She's done the work, right? And they're doing the work. So it's not, you know, to some degree, I think there's people, as is often the case, when there's a perception of change or something new, it seems like, you know, there's a boulder, you're rolling up a hill. When in fact, it's not complicated, actually, because it's inclusion. In some ways, I mean, it's not as if somehow American history itself changes. It is who is on that playing field that changes. Right? It's not a whole new game.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Another question was, how would you suggest that one goes about advocating for implementation within a district?
For the general, I think advocating is probably a necessary in some communities, that you really do need to ensure that these actions are being taken. Several things you can do. You can take that checklist I gave you. You can see if there has been a resolution passed by your school board. And I know that some citizens groups and organizations have really pushed to make sure that that is an official, because making that a resolution by a board makes it a public commitment, right, to the public. And I think that is a really important step. It presumes accountability and that the work will be done. The next thing would be to actually look at the curriculum, or to bring someone in to look at the curriculum. What was so fabulous about the steps that Elizabeth took is they actually had someone come in and they said, look through the curriculum and show us the gaps. You know, show us where kind of Black people just disappear out of the story. And then the fix, so it isn't coming in saying you kind of revamp the entire curriculum, right? It's coming in saying Black people really do disappear in areas of the curriculum, and where that happens, show us how to fill those in, and then prepare teachers to teach what could be new material. And so I would suggest the community do those things. Number one, have a board resolution. Number two, make sure someone from the outside, because there are districts who've done it internally, which is probably not best practice, let's just say. I think there needs to be someone from the outside that comes in and looks at the curriculum. I think school teachers are the experts on curriculum. I give all of my just so much honor and confidence in teachers as professionals with training, experience, expertise. And sometimes I think we overlook them and shoot straight for the consultant when the teachers are the ones who are there on the front line. And so if one can do those 3 steps, resolution, identify gaps, and then do the correctives, I think that's fairly easy actually for a community to kind of monitor that process is in place also.
Great. We have a wide range of folks on the call, but this question is about what is your understanding of how far Montclair has come in the implementation?
Well, from the executive director of the Amistad Commission, she considers Montclair to be one of the model districts for implementation. But in some ways, I'm similar to Donna, and my kids are late 20s, early 30s. I will say that they think they received a very inclusive education. In fact, one of them is a PhD and teaches African American literature. So I still think the process is the same for the community, for Montclair, for my own, my own neighbors. I actually don't know if Montclair has a resolution. I believe they do. But I think the process of someone looking at the curriculum and seeing where the gaps lie should be a continual process. Right? It's a continual process as any district uses to constantly, kind of evaluate, reevaluate, and revamp and assess. So I do think the community should use that same process in Montclair.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Edwards.
Can I just answer Dr. Edwards? I have to go to teach at Montclair, not teach, but a faculty meeting. Yeah. And I asked our Board of Ed, former President Jessica DeConick, all the while you were speaking, I asked her what we're doing. We have a resolution. We have a lot of work being done. She sent me all sorts of information. I'll try to share it with all of you. I'll get it to all of you, but there's a lot of work being done. Right. Not that we're a model. I don't think we're a model, but as a former mayor who appointed the Board of Ed, I understand how this all works. And I'll get some more information from our Board of Ed member, who's also a league member, Jessica DeConick, but she says we have a robust effort being made and there's teachers working on this with the teachers union, MEA. So certainly I think Montclair maybe be ahead of others, but we're certainly not doing as much as I think we should, but I think we've come a long way. So I have to run to teach, to deal with my other fellow teachers, which I'm gonna bring this up with the Montclair faculty members right now, but thank you so much, Doctor.
Yeah,
I gotta run. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Good to see you.
Thank you. So we do have another question. This is, I believe, from a parent who says, what new textbooks are being recommended? I have a first grader who's still being taught in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Yeah. Textbooks are a real issue, as many of you may know, because the industry responds to the marketplace, and whatever, wherever the biggest marketplace is, kind of defines the content. And very often, that's Texas and states in the Southeast are actually defining the textbooks. And there has been no or very little trickle down from the history that students are reading in college is completely different than the K-12 curriculum. It's not reflecting even the last 40 years of the way history has been interpreted. I had a Drew student from New Jersey who said to me that, in her high school, she had just been told that Rosa Parks was old and tired. And this was right after our lesson on the civil rights movement. And she said, and I asked them, if that's not true, why do we even think that? The textbook issue's a tough one. I do know there are new series that have been created specifically to be more inclusive. When my kids were at what is now Buzz Aldrin, they were using The History of Us, which was just this phenomenal new series that had history read like a story narrative, right? And was very inclusive. You know, it will take a really hard search to fill in that textbook piece. But listen, for the best of teachers, they are never tied to the textbook, right? I mean, you don't teach a textbook. A textbook is a tool. And so I think the combination of finding new resources, you know, I won't name any names for teachers, but I do know teachers in Montclair who said to my kids, we aren't reading that. We're going to read something else. But that would only be a teacher who knows from their own training and research what the something else would be. And they are trained and comfortable with that alternative, right? That actually is the kind of work I think the Amistad Commission should be doing. One of the first things we did, Donna, in 2003, a year after Governor McGreevey had created the commission and the legislation was passed, was in fact to look at textbooks and everything that was inclusive. And people would say, oh, this is great. And I said, that's a college textbook. You know, kind of there's nothing here that's even high school. So one of the things I think the commission can do is maybe to bring some pressure on publishers, but also to actually come up with the alternatives for teachers. You know, that we should take as much of the workload off of teachers as possible and say, we have provided for you these alternatives from which you may choose. But these are all alternatives that are inclusive of all Americans, right, in the story. But that really is a tough one. But I think the informed and interested citizens should really push the commission in areas where teachers need help and to provide that support.
I mean, and also, Lillie, you and I have talked also, you know, how can the League of Women Voters get involved in this? And I think,
Right.
you know, in the whole area of when teaching an inclusive curriculum, the history of voting rights in America, the ongoing efforts of voter suppression, groups like the NAACP, the League of Women Voters for, 100 years working, to always be expanding voting rights, always engaging voters. I think that this is something definitely in our wheelhouse. And I think as an organization, we're certainly committed to it and would like to get more involved. We're still, we're just on the grassroots level, we're still trying to get into high schools or get teachers to call us back to do voting registration drives in local schools. It's hard to get in sometimes, to tell you the truth, to be invited,
I believe it.
So Anne, is there anything else that people are bringing up?
There's a few other questions. We can certainly send these all to Dr. Edwards, but one of the last ones was, do you find teachers are struggling with teaching African-American history because they're not sure of what that information looks like?
Exactly. Yes. That's the whole purpose of Amistad Institutes and workshops. But again, I keep going back to the teachers themselves as the kind of experts and facilitators. Clearly, there are teachers who have always taught an inclusive curriculum. It simply is the way they understand the excellence of both the delivery, the excellence of learning. They understand that kids can deal with really tough questions, right? Because kindergartners ask tough questions. Of course they can deal with tough questions. Or as I have reminded people, I don't know if any Disney cartoon that's not filled with tragedy, right? And a lot to be terribly frightening. Kids can actually deal with these issues and problems and questions when we present it to them in ways which are age appropriate, and which engages their minds, right? And their creativity and their intellect. It makes it exciting. It makes learning exciting. I think that we need to recognize we're working in a space, in a racial space in America, which is terrified of race and racism. So we just try to ignore it, which doesn't work because it's who we are and have always been from the very beginning. And our fear of it, of course, translates to what does and doesn't happen in the classroom, but it translates into our students' own lives of how they negotiate in the world, and an American world that is becoming browner and browner, right? And so they can't even operate if there's this fear of people who look different. And so I think there are ways, right, in which teachers can be very well equipped to deal comfortably and profoundly with subject matters about race and difference, about issues of inequality and injustice, to deal with democracy as something we are working to achieve, right? That it's a goal. It isn't something that's been given or guaranteed. But I'm not sure we have created any mechanism to really provide that kind of support and training for teachers' comfort level and raising the bar in terms of expertise. One of the things I will mention that the Amistad Commission has talked about for a long time and hasn't happened, that kind of may need some civic engagement, and that is why not make certain requirements, why not embed certain kinds of requirement and training into teacher certification? And so that teachers are trained to both have a diversity in their classrooms, right? And New Jersey and other states recognize that, kind of the demographics are shifting. And then also train teachers in an inclusive curriculum so they have a good start.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Edwards. It's a pleasure as always. And to everyone else, thank you so much for attending tonight. Just so that you know, we've saved the chat and we'll be passing on your comments and questions to Dr. Edwards for her to use in her work. And we've also recorded this and will be available to anyone who wasn't able to see it earlier on or get on. So again, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much, Lillie. It's great to see you. And good job.
Well, thank you, Donna and Ann, and thank you, League of Women Voters, for the work you are